Welcome to Wonderfest 2008, the Bay Area Festival of Science. I'm Tucker Hyatt, the director of Wonderfest, and I'm delighted that you're all here today. We actually had two crowds early today that were essentially standing room only. The evening seems to have drawn a few others away, weary from perhaps Halloween night last night, but thank you all for being here. Wonder plus generosity and foresight conspire to make Wonderfest possible each year, and this is the 10th anniversary of Wonderfest. There are so many individuals and institutions who deserve our gratitude. First, there's the Stanford Chemistry Department and its chair, Professor Richard Zare. There's my own academic home, the Branson School, under the leadership of Woody Price. And of course, there are the generous corporate supporters of Wonderfest. Annual Reviews, which underwrites the Carl Sagan Prize for Science Popularization, and also underwrites the online presentation of Wonderfest videos. There's the Stephen Bechtel Fund, which funded the direct mail campaign that introduced so many of you to Wonderfest. And much of the Wonder Cup Challenge High School Science Contest is paid for by Bechtel. Also, Wind River Systems, which funds the first place prizes, those MacBook computers which you'll see given out tonight. And the Harold F. and Suzanne D. Falk Foundation, which supplied so many of the other student prizes that led to the championship round this evening. And last, but certainly not least, there is a small group of dedicated individuals whose support of Wonderfest has personally inspired me and has brought Wonderfest back from the brink of oblivion on several occasions. These people are Wonderfest technical director Eric Yao, who, by the way, produces these very nice Wonderfest ID cards. Eric will shut down, Picture Shut down. Picture at about 8:30 tonight here, but if you'd like to get your ID card and flirt with the truth some more in graphic form, tomorrow at Berkeley is the place to be. Or go to picturoo.com. Eric, a great guy. Also, Wonderfest fans, Rowena and Mike Holliday, the Douglas and Raymond Kramlich family of San Francisco, and the Wonderfest wife, the lovely and understanding Darlene Hyatt. Please give these individuals and institutions a big round of applause, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Master of Ceremonies for the evening. Richard Hart is a celebrated journalist who has been reporting on science and technology for more than 20 years. Well known as the co-host of the former NBC Evening Magazine, Richard has hosted a variety of programs on CBS Radio, the Discovery and USA TV networks, and the Sci-Fi Channel. He is the only person ever to win a DuPont Columbia Journalism Award for investigative reporting and an Emmy Award for comedy. Today, Richard is pioneering new techniques to acquire and deliver video. He is, for example, instrumental in getting Wonderfest video online. He was the first and remains one of the few journalists providing high-definition news reports for broadcast. Richard holds a degree in physics, a pilot's license, and a black belt in Taekwondo. So welcome him warmly if you know what's good for you. Here comes Richard Hart.
Thank you, Tucker. I'll put this on as I'm talking to you. I'm quite a guy. But I'm not going to be funny tonight because tonight we're talking about science. I say that in jest, but I tell this story every year about visiting Lawrence Livermore Laboratory to do a little story about something called sea gel, otherwise known as aerogel. How many of you know what aerogel or sea gel is? Okay, it's this amazing stuff that they call it solid smoke because it's almost invisible at certain angles, yet it'll support the weight of Tucker Hyatt here. I guess I like these badges so much I have two of them. There's one waiting for me here. That's me. Because I'm using that mic. I'm a professional. I have to have my microphone turned on for me. God, what's next? Diapers? All right. Tucker has already thanked many people here, but this is, of course, our 10th anniversary, and many of you are first-timers here. I think about half of you. How many are here for the first time? That's amazing. That is truly amazing. You missed a great 9 years. We've had some really, really great questions in dialogues between two people who are the experts in their field. But mostly, I like to call it a trialogue because you guys can get involved. And there's no other place, to my knowledge, where people can walk in off the street and ask questions of the people who are the top experts in their fields. And see wonderful guys like those 4 hoodlums hanging out at the door here, who have just won a wonderful prize and will be presented even more wonderful prizes in just a moment. I kid you, they're smarter than I am, and I'll probably rely on them in my retirement, so I love you guys. So, what are we here for? We're about to get them involved in a little competition, which we've been doing now for almost 10 years, and that involves 4 professional researchers, or 4 professional scientists. That sounds so funny, professional scientists. Like, what's a professional? It's an oxymoron. Or against 4 professional high school students, and I think through the years, hasn't it come out about, they're about even. Yeah, sometimes the students win, sometimes the pros win. Yes, yeah, yes. And one thing that Tucker has given some thanks here, but I want to, we could do this at the end, but I'd like to do it right at the top here. This is a monumental effort putting this thing together every year, and it was the brainstorm and the brainchild of one man, and it is a year-long effort. He doesn't start 2 months before the event. He works on it all the time. He gets some amazing people to agree to appear here, and I just can't imagine that he does it without a staff of 100 people. So I personally would like to thank Tucker Hyatt for putting this darn thing on for 10 years. Now, each year, one thing we do is present a prize for the popularization of science, and it's something that is very, very important and sort of represents what we're doing here at Wonderfest. And that is bringing people like you and friends, we hope. We hope you bring some more people with you to Berkeley tomorrow, and maybe next year even bring more people, so we need even a larger venue here. The story I tell every year, and I'll tell it very briefly again, is going to Lawrence Livermore and talking to some people, doing a little interview for a television story, and telling them, okay, now that we've done the interview, we need some pictures of you guys out working in the lab. And the head of the lab asked, do you want us to put our lab coats on? And I said, well, do you normally wear lab coats for this? And he said, no, we normally wear sweatshirts. And I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, CNN was here and they made us put on the lab coats. And I thought, not again. You know. So there is a public perception that is not really the public's perception. It's the news media's perception. And every time I've worked with colleagues who are great and understand and do great stories, but I frequently throw my shoe at the screen because I see somebody doing a story which treats the people who do the research and the scientists whom we're honoring with Wonderfest with such a weird reverence and attitude that you would think they weren't normal people. And as we all know, they are normal people. I know a couple of scientists, and they're here. But right now it's time to honor those. Every year doing, I have my own heckler here, and he's a scientist, so I can't say anything. So to present the award this year, we have a friend who was just mentioned by Tucker a moment ago, who has been very, very instrumental in making this happen, particularly at Stanford, and has helped us out with all sorts of things like computer help, and also makes this a fun event by lending his own sense of humor to it, and that's Dick Zare, who is chairman of the chemistry department here at Stanford, and he is going to carry on from here. Dick.
I have the honor this evening of making this Carl Sagan Award for the popularization of science to Professor Robert Sapolsky. This is a person who's a neurobiologist. If you go onto iTunes, you can learn why zebras don't get ulcers. He's very much interested in stress. He tells me that the first signs of stress are that your digestive system starts to shut down and you get a dry mouth when you speak. Where's my water? And so much. He's done so much, and from all types of things, and I hope he'll tell us about some of this. But first, it's my pleasure to present him with this award. This award consists of a plaque. Show you. And a check for $5,000.
For the camera. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dick. And thank you for everyone who had something to do with my being here right now, which is clearly a mysterious process. I'm very glad to be here for at least two reasons. One is I spent a huge amount of my lecturing life in this room, and so it's great that I don't have to think of any final exam questions based on what I'm going to say. The second reason is in the context of Carl Sagan, in that Carl Sagan went to the same high school my sister did. And through an astonishing act of luck, I didn't have to go to that high school. And it was a complete, well, it's remarkable that he got out of there and did what he did. But nonetheless, sort of the sense that our paths almost crossed gives this sort of an extra edge here. Now, what I do in addition to running a lab and doing research and all of that is a lot of writing for non-scientists. And it's something I love doing. And I realized that one of the big reasons for it, or a reason why I think I'm able to sort of communicate some concepts in science to non-scientists, is that basically, in my heart of hearts, I'm not really a scientist. And that my temperament and background is much more in social science, and I did an astonishingly small amount of real science when I was in college, so there's just huge gaps of knowledge on my part, and I think I retain a pretty good intuition as to when the panic begins to come in, when there's just a couple of syllables too many in words being thrown at you. So I think that reflects that I still am perfectly capable of being horrified at the things I'm willing to lecture about when I'm not understanding a word of what I'm saying. So under those occasions, that's maybe somewhat of an accessible writing for non-scientists. Now, the particular area that I write about is sort of one that's broadly related to the work that I do, which is understanding the biology of behavior. And very often, not just behavior, but human behavior, and human social behavior, and often abnormal human social behavior. And this is a very interesting realm of trying to understand how a bunch of molecules into a bunch of neurons into a bunch of, and out the other end comes the behavior that makes us who we are. Part of what is most striking about it is just the incredibly unlikely findings that have been emerging in the last few years or so in terms of understanding us as biological machines. One example of it, and this was one that was all over the news a couple of months ago, a finding that there's a particular gene in humans that has a particular promoter, and don't panic if those are not familiar terms to you, but the promoter comes in two different flavors, and an enormous literature with animals over the years suggested something that should be the case with humans, and it turned out to be the case, which is if you have a certain variant of that promoter, you're much more happily married on the average than if you have the other variant. And out in the world of rodents, their equivalents determine if they are a monogamous or a polygamous species. So that's a rather odd thing. Or other domains. There's a whole set of findings out of something that's called the Dutch hunger winter. And what those studies have shown is if you starved while you were a third trimester fetus, 60 years later, you would have a bigger appetite than other people. And you would be more prone towards diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Because something about the fetal brain decides how much nutrition there is out there, and forever after has something to do with your appetite. So your experience as a fetus. Another example, there's a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which everyone should want to have because it's fairly important. It's proportionately the biggest part of our brains. It's the most recently evolved. We've got more of it than any other species out there. And essentially what the frontal cortex does is it keeps you doing the right thing, even if it's the harder thing. And what the frontal cortex is responsible for is it keeps you from being a serial murderer, or it makes you tell the hostess how amazing the food was and you would love to have the recipe, whereas it was the most unpalatable thing you've ever eaten in your life, that it makes you do the right things even though they're harder. And what's fascinating about it is, for one thing, it's the last part of the brain to fully develop. Something that will explain a lot about college, which is we don't have frontal cortices that are fully online until we're about 25 years old. Another interesting thing about it is it's a part of the brain that sustains some of the most damage during normal aging. And in other words, you've got about 4.5 years after age 25 where you're completely good at gratification postponement, and it's just downhill after that. Which is, if this is the last part of the brain to develop, and parentheses, one of the most defining of what makes us who we are, if it's the last part of the brain to develop, it's the part of the brain that's least constrained by genes and most shaped by experience. And one other implication of that is a very simple finding, which is approximately 25% of the men on death row in this country have a history of concussive head trauma damaging the frontal cortex. And what our criminal justice system is supposed to do with that, where you have a system where in some domains you get damage there and you become an organism of just unspeakable reptilian violence, and in other circumstances the same damage, and you're somebody who plays the piano at the Thanksgiving get-togethers way longer than anybody wants to listen to. Where do these two different outcomes come from? So more of these sorts of things that make us just marvel at the biology lurking underneath the surface. Whole new class of diseases called PANDAS diseases. And if I can remember the acronym, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychological disorder associated with streptococcus. Okay, here's the deal with that. You're about 3 years old and you get a bad strep infection and you happen to run a high fever and you're 1 out of 10,000 where something goes wrong at this point. You recover from the strep, everything's fine, and about 3 weeks later you explode into obsessive compulsive disorder. And it completely takes over your life. And what's going on there, as far as people can tell, in a subset of kids, when you get very high fevers in that circumstance, something about the blood-brain barrier opens up and your immune system suddenly gets access to parts of your brain that Doran doesn't normally see and decides that it's foreign stuff and attacks one part of your brain, which seems to have something to do with obsessive compulsive disorder. And you go in and you try to immune suppress the kid to get the antibodies down, and everything's fine until they get another fever, and 2 weeks later they have obsessive compulsive disorder again. And a substantial percentage of adults with OCD have antibodies against this part of the brain. You get a fever as a 3-year-old and you've got the worst luck with your blood-brain barrier, and as an adult you compulsively have to count stairs when you go up them and make sure the utensils are perfectly symmetrical before you can eat. There's biology just going on in all sorts of odd domains. Final example, and this is one my lab has been working on in recent years, is sort of our lunatic fringe project, which is there's this parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, and people are understanding all sorts of things about it, that it gets into the nervous system. One place you definitely do not want it to get into the nervous system of is a fetus. Toxoplasma is found in the feces of cats, which is why pregnant women should get suddenly very uptight about having cat litter around, but it also gets into the adult brain. And it turns out in rodents, it does something very interesting. It takes rodents who innately are scared of the smell of cats, and it makes them love the smell of cats. And they get eaten by cats. And toxo can only reproduce sexually in the gut of cats. How's that for clever? And what we're beginning to figure out is toxo makes cat urine smell sexually attractive to rodents. And that's why they go right up to it and then get eaten. So what about toxo in the human brain? It turns out 2 different groups have shown this independently. people who are toxo-infected get a little bit reckless. They don't go up and sniff cat urine, but what they do instead is wind up with 3 to 4 times the likelihood of dying in a car accident involving speeding. What's going on? You got a certain promoter of a gene, and that changes the likelihood that you're going to have a 60th wedding anniversary. What happens to you as a fetus? You get infected with some parasite, and that suddenly makes you much less prudent. This is a very different world we're dealing with. And what's most striking is none of this stuff was known 30, 40 years ago. And what that also almost certainly implies is we're going to get new versions of these popping up that we can't even imagine now. And eventually, all of us are going to have 2 or 3 of those labels. And what becomes interesting at that point is, what's society going to do with you when everybody comes with a couple of labels of a mild neuropsychiatric disorder and some sort of developmental something or other? And what we know is, God help you if you are poor or poorly connected, because that's exactly when society decides to deny you health insurance or fair housing or all of that. But in a larger sense, what's going to happen as we learn more and more about your biological organisms, and that's lurking through every moment of our behavior? One good outcome of it would be is if we recognize domains where we've got to be humane and compassionate where it never occurred to us before. One example of this, amazing disease, if you don't have it and you're just a nice scientist who can write papers about it, but amazing disease, Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome. Everybody knows about Tourette syndrome, obsessive scatology, uncontrolled cursing that doesn't begin to scratch the surface. People with Tourette's curse uncontrollably. They also bark. They make animal sounds. They have facial tics. They grab at their throat. They grab at their crotch. These storms of inappropriate tick-like behavior. This is not the case of somebody getting disinhibited in their secret heart of hearts. They've always wanted to quack like a duck, and this is the person who gives into it, whereas the rest of us restrain ourselves. No, this is a disease where it's almost like seizures of the id going on and just these little tick things happening there. So Tourette's is a recognized neuropsychiatric disorder. People are beginning to understand the genetics of it, the neurochemistry of it, all of that, and it's fascinating. Now think back, what did Tourette's look like 500 years ago? It has a slight bias for females over males. It tends to have an onset around puberty. Hormones have something to do with it. So you're back in the 1500s, and some girl suddenly starts uncontrollably cursing and all sorts of blasphemous stuff like that. And what's the only logical conclusion as a good 15th century behavioral biologist? They're obsessed. They're possessed. Thank you. They're possessed. A colleague of mine who does the same thing for me in faculty meetings. They're possessed by the devil. And the standard clinical treatment, almost certainly at the time for Tourette syndrome, was you burn somebody at the stake. A couple of years ago, I had a student in one of my classes who had Tourette's. And during the first office hours, he came in, and he didn't have a bad case. He had a few facial tics and such. But he came in, and he was explaining to me about the disease and sort of what the features were of it. And he sort of was very pleased to know that I had heard about it and knew something about it, and explained to me some of the things that had to go on in the exams so that he wouldn't be disrupted. And he was very glad, and he spent the entire time doing that. This was the Tourette's, and this was who he was trying to control it. And what happens now? Where have we gotten with our scientific insight? This same neurochemical disorder that got you burned at the stake 500 years ago, now you get to take the MCATs in a separate group from everybody else so you don't bother them with your barking. In terms of thinking about ourselves as biological machines. So hopefully, one direction this will take us is a lot more humanity and a lot more humaneness in recognizing there, but for a few more neurotransmitter receptors go I, and pushing us in sort of realms of needing to be compassionate that we couldn't have guessed at not that long ago. But the domain where this really begins to disturb people as you're going into one more finding after another, suggesting that we are nothing but the products of our biology, is right around that point. A lot of people get the heebie-jeebies. They get really uncomfortable with all of that sort of mechanistic notion, and what that really taps into is this sort of, indulgent sort of thing that we all nurse there, which is each one of us is just this flickering flame of individuality who can never be caught and never described. And suddenly there's this worry that no scientist will go and inadvertently explain everything and know more and more about less and less, and all of the magic of who we are will disappear down the drain with these lifeless droid scientists. There's no reason to worry about that. There's no reason to worry, despite that being a very deeply felt one. Wonderfully summarized in a classic science fiction story, Arthur C. Clarke, 9 Billion Names of God. So in that story, there are 9 billion names of God according to Tibetan religious belief, obviously a metaphor for the unknowable. And in it, a bunch of computer scientists have come up with some humongous computer and teamed up with the Tibetan monks, and they're now spitting out the 9 billion names of God. They are, in the metaphor, scientifically attaining the unattainable, attaining the things perhaps that shouldn't be attained. And as the story goes, as each new name is spit out, one of the stars in the sky goes dark. And this is exactly the fear that far too many people have about science and science about the biology of who we are. As we learn more and more about less and less and rob us of all that magic, the lights in the heavens will go out. We don't need to ever worry about that for 2 reasons. Even if we go and with our science inadvertently explain everything, it's no big deal. You could turn Bach into a bunch of rules about contrapunting, composing. You can take a gazelle leaping and turn it into a bunch of biomechanical equations, and that is not going to decrease in any way our wonder at gazelles leaping or cathedral organs thundering. And just because there's levels of structure, we would not have guessed that initially. That does not rob us of our ability to be moved by it one bit. But the more important reason why we don't have to worry about this is we're never going to inadvertently go and explain everything. Because every time we come up with an answer to something, there's 10 more questions that are much better. And this was wonderfully summarized by this geneticist, J.B.S. Haldane, who did classic genetics work early in the last century and then spent his last couple of decades just coming up with great sound bites. And he had one about the nature of science, which is life is not only stranger than we imagine, life is stranger than we can imagine. And that's the critical point. The purpose of science is not to cure us of a sense of mystery. The purpose of science is to always reinvent that sense and reinvigorate it. So on that note, I'm clearly preaching to the choir if all of you guys have shown up here at a meeting like this, but thank you again.